A short video to introduce some visual vocabulary. I call this lecture Visual Literacy because we're literally trying to learn how to read images, how to read paintings, drawings, photographs, sculptures, etc., and being able to understand what's going on in them and what they mean to us. We want to be able to verbalize our own thoughts. Sometimes just knowing the words to verbalize what we're thinking, what we're seeing, can really help us to organize our own understanding and our own opinions and feelings about something. But of course, this visual vocabulary will also help you to better communicate what you see with other people. And really, nothing is too obvious. It's worth stating everything that you see and then being able to determine how you feel or think about it. Lastly, we want to be able to articulate a considered response with clarity. So not just jumping to our first gut instinct, but really considering an image from multiple points of view, multiple facets, and then being able to participate in a discussion, say in our class or in the paper that you will write, maybe in your essays and your exams. But hopefully even after this course, this will be something that you can, vocabulary that you can use in your life at large. Of course, these terms that we're going to be learning will also be really helpful when you're using a formal analysis. So you remember that a formal analysis is analyzing a work and trying to derive its meaning from the form alone, just from what you can visually see of the piece, of its physical and visual presence. So a formal analysis is going to be very linked with our visual vocabulary today. Now, we're going to start with just learning how to kind of diagnose the appearance of an artwork. And when you first approach an artwork, you're going to diagnose it as either being representational or non-representational. Now, representational works could include works like these. A representational work is any artwork in which you can recognize the forms from the real world. Now, these two paintings by Picasso at various points of his career look very different. However, in both of them we can recognize the human form. And so they're both representational, even though they are kind of different subcategories within representational. So you can think of the word representational as sort of a big umbrella term. And now we're going to learn a few more specific types of representation that we might encounter. One type of representational work that tends to be pretty impressive to us is work that we could describe as being photorealistic. That means that it's a work that is not a photograph, but reproduces reality as a photograph does. It appears like a photograph. So this oil painting by Richard Estes is very impressive in its skill and technique because he has been able to render the painting exactly the same way that a photograph would. These two images give us a good example of terms we could call naturalistic or realistic. So they don't appear like photographs. However, the oil painting on the left is very true to life in its appearance. The skin tones, the proportions of these humans feel very lifelike. We feel like we might be able to recognize these people walking on the street. The marble sculpture on the right, we could say that it's not naturalistic in color because it's just the natural color of the marble. However, the details of the face, the furrowed brow, the texture of the hair, the believable fabric around his neck, all these things are very naturalistic or realistic. They appear very true to life. Another type of representational artwork could be called illusionistic or trompe-l'oeil, meaning literally to fool the eye in French. And these are artworks that go beyond just being realistic or naturalistic, but literally they're trying to fool us. They're trying to fool the viewers. They want us to feel, in this painting by William Harnett, he wants us to feel that we could walk up and take that hat off the hook and put it on our own heads, or we could walk up and feel the fur of that rabbit. So he's really trying to trip us up, to be illusionistic. Another category of representational art could be idealized. Both of these artworks would be idealized in that they conform to their own culture's idea of beauty or perfection. Now, when you diagnose something as being idealized, you have to know a little bit about its culture, the culture from which it comes, and what their standard of beauty was. Now, particularly with the female form, although sometimes with the male form, we can see different ideas of what is beautiful or what is quote-unquote perfect. Even in just the last 100 years in Western culture, there have been generations that really wanted to see the female form being very voluptuous, very curvy, and there have also been generations where it was considered more perfect or ideal to be quote-unquote waif-like, very thin and without many curves. So you have to know something about the culture in order to recognize their form of idealization. Another type of representation could be called stylized. Stylized works are not just an individual artist's sense of style, but it's actually a sense of a whole culture, a whole group of artists conforming to their culture's standard of depiction. And the Egyptians give us a great example of this. In ancient Egypt, for more or less 3,000 years, they had the same standard of depiction, the same stylization of their forms. So it didn't matter who the artist was, when during that 3,000 years they were sculpting or making art, but all during that period they were using the same system of proportions, the same type of stance or symbolic headdress, the same kind of figures over and over again. And so we can look at the Egyptian art as very stylized. It conforms to their culture's standard of depiction. Now, within representation, sometimes you have artworks like this, where you recognize the real-world form. On the left, we see a landscape with a haystack, and on the right, we see a figure. Possibly, we would think it to be a female figure. But both of these are also a bit distorted. So they're real-world forms that have been altered or distorted, and we could say this is representational abstraction. Abstraction is anytime something is a bit distorted or different from how it appears in true life, in real life. Now, some artists take abstraction to a far end where it becomes non-representational. A non-representational artwork is an image or an artwork that does not represent real-world forms. It's pretty simple. So every artwork that you see will either be representational or non-representational. This image by Kandinsky gives us a good example of non-representational abstraction. He often talked about making paintings the way that composers can make music, that paintings can use color and rhythm and line and shape the way that you could use drums and a violin and a cello and a flute in a symphony, that it doesn't have to have representational imagery to make a beautiful image. So I think that can be a helpful metaphor to think about non-representational abstraction as being something like instrumental music. But abstraction, non-representational abstraction, can also look like this. It can look very hard-edged, with these nice horizontals and verticals that Mondrian used in a very simplified color palette. So both of these would be called non-representational paintings. Now, as artists, we are aware of a whole system. You could think of it as a whole alphabet of visual elements like line, shape, form, and space, etc. And then also a system of principles of design. And these principles are almost like grammar for a language. So we've kind of got our alphabet and our grammatical system. Now we won't go through each of these, but we're just going to kind of highlight a few just to get us practiced at looking and putting words to our vision. Like I said, there's nothing too obvious. It's great just to describe what you see. So these are familiar words, but can be really helpful in describing the shapes and the lines that you see. Geometric versus organic, or rectilinear versus curvilinear. For instance, this chair up here we could describe as very geometric and very rectilinear with its verticals and horizontals, as opposed to this chair that's got these great curvilinear lines that feel kind of organically flowing back and forth. As well as this building here by Antonio Gaudi, a beautiful and very unique building with these kind of curving lines across the balconies and across the sides. So very curvilinear and surprising in that as a work of architecture. A contour line is a specific type of line. It's a line that describes the three-dimensional boundary of a form. Now, if you imagine laying your hand down on your piece of paper right now and tracing the outside of it, we would call that an outline. And that's one part of a contour line. But what makes the contour different than the outline is that the contour line also could describe the boundary going across the front of the hand rather than just the outline. And by doing that, it gives you a sense of a spatial quality, a spatial volume. In an abstract form or non-representational form, this image on the right by Bridget Riley, a painting called Drift, even though it's non-representational, just the way that she's curving those lines gives us a sense of a three-dimensional boundary and therefore a sense of space. Directional lines are linear elements that lead us through a composition, and these two photographs by Cartier-Bresson are great examples of that. Now, I like to say that a great work of art leads you through it. It uses every bit of the page or every bit of the canvas, and it moves your eye through it almost like a pinball machine or like a roller coaster. So your eye is constantly moving. And in this image, you can kind of let your eye bounce around this line of the overhang and down, and then maybe you kind of drift down the staircase, and you kind of drift around here and down these rolls here, and even across to the back there, and your eye just flows around the whole composition and even sort of gets thrown back around. It's almost like you can never escape from it, right? That's a good thing. The artist doesn't want you to walk away from it. They want you to stay and investigate over and over again. And in this second photograph, it's such a great spiral going down that staircase and the line of the curve going so quickly from right to left, and then you can almost make your way back through the spiral again and again. So those are directional lines leading our eye through the composition. We also have implied lines. So these are not lines that are present in the composition, but lines of sight or pathways created by connecting similar forms or following the gaze of other figures. So while there are some linear directional lines here, we could say, or here in these poles, but here we're talking about implied lines. So lines of sight, we might connect these yellow hats and kind of create an implied line between all the yellow hats that stand out a bit. Or, this is a great image, Renoir's The Boating Party. It's a great image to follow each person's eye and gaze across the whole composition. So we might look at this standing figure who seems to be looking toward the back, and maybe he's looking at her and she's looking over this direction. And so we find our eyes on this man who's looking back over here, and she who's looking at the dog. We see that this man is looking down at this woman, and she sort of looks off the page. And so we find ourselves looking from eye to eye to see who's looking at who, and it leads us through the whole composition in a really intriguing way. Again, with geometric and organic shapes now, rather than just lines or static and dynamic, these two architectural works are pretty dynamic and exciting. Frank Gehry's museum in Bilbao, Spain, on the upper left there, he really uses these great organic shapes, and you almost feel like the whole museum is kind of windswept and kind of swaying. It really helps that it's on this water, it's on this body of water, and so you feel like the shapes of the architecture, like these big sails taking in wind. So very organic and very dynamic. This piece by Moshe Safdie, Habitat in Montreal in 1967, is very geometric in its form, all these kind of nice small little cubes. And they feel, even though they're kind of in an unexpected setup, they're still very strong and sort of static. Now, static could possibly sound like not a complimentary term, but here we just mean that it feels stable. Whereas Gehry's building felt a little more kind of windswept or in movement, right? So static and dynamic. Here again, this image by Edward Hopper is fairly static. It uses a lot of rectilinear lines, strong horizontals that feel very stable, and strong verticals, as opposed to this piece by Caravaggio with these diagonal axes across here, and you feel the motion of the raising of St. Peter's crucifix as he is being martyred. And so there's a very dynamic flow to this second composition. Our last term with shapes, is positive and negative, or figure and ground. And you've probably seen little games like this that test whether you see this black space as this black shape, I should say, if you see this kind of as a vase or chalice, or if you become more aware of the white shapes as two faces looking in on each other. And the same here in the reverse, if you see it as a white chalice or a white space between two black faces. The positive form would be thought of as the form that is present. So if you see this as a white chalice, then this would be the positive form, and the negative would be what we might also describe as sort of background. Now, certain artists like M.C. Escher here on the right has really intentionally and playfully engaged these ideas of positive and negative, or figure and ground, so that on the left side of the composition, the black form of a bird is the positive figure, the present shape, and the white becomes the ground, or the negative. But as you move across to the right, the white becomes the positive and the figure of the bird, and the black has become the ground. So that's a very playful figure-ground relationship in that image. Pause the video here for a moment and see if you can use this vocabulary list to describe this image at the right of Napoleon enthroned. Now, when you're looking at two-dimensional artworks, one of the most kind of magical parts of looking at artworks is when something that is flat, something that's a flat piece of paper or a canvas, can make you believe that there is space in it. And there's just something miraculous about that. But it'd be good for us to be able to look at artworks that create space, or the illusion of space, and being able to understand how they've done it. So I'm just going to show you a couple of tools that artists use to create the illusion of depth or space. One would be the contrast of value. Now, value is an artistic term for the quality of light or dark. It might be what you might call shading, or modeling. And so here they've used light and dark value, or light and dark shading, to give us a sense that there's light falling on the top of this man's head and shadows falling along the side of it, or light falling here above his brow and shadow falling underneath it. And just that sense of highlights and shadows gives us a sense of volume in his face. Now on the right, Hans Hofmann, although he's making a non-representational artwork here, is using a contrast of hue, or which is another word for color. And so this bright yellow and bright warm red, they really come forward toward us, whereas the cool blues and greens and darker blues and greens tend to kind of sit back from us. So these yellows and reds feel like they're closer, while the blues and greens seem like they're farther away. Also creating the illusion of space, we can see at work in this Degas painting the contrast of scale. So we see these smaller dancers and these larger dancers, and we assume, our mind assumes, that the larger ones must be closer to us. There's also active here the sense of overlap. So because this figure interrupts this figure, and they interrupt the ones behind them and the ones over here, we use terms like behind. We're fooled into believing that these ones are closer because they seem to overlap the others. They seem to be in front of and blocking our view of the others. So that's a sense of overlap. Foreshortening. Now this is a bit of a tricky one, both to define and also for artists to use, but it's also one of the most persuasive. Foreshortening means depicting a form as perpendicular to the picture plane and shorter than in reality to give the sense of recession or projection. Now I know that's a mouthful, but let me show you what I mean. Here, this man's arms that come toward the picture plane, they're not parallel to it, but perpendicular to it. This hand, we believe, is closer to us because it seems larger. And we know how the human body works. We assume that there's probably 5 or 6 feet of space between this hand and that. And so that would be a great example of foreshortening. It's perpendicular to the picture plane, and it seems shorter than we know it must be, but we read into that and we say, well, there must be 5 or 6 feet of space between the front of the table and back here where Christ is. Such a convincing way to create space. On the upper left, with Manet's Dead Toreador, he doesn't put the body quite perpendicular to the picture plane, but it's also not fully parallel. And so we see, kind of looking down the top of the Toreador's head down toward his feet. And that too is a great example of foreshortening. Now, linear perspective is one with which you might be familiar, and it was a Renaissance tool, a Renaissance invention that allowed them to portray space in a very believable way. It's based on the observation that forms which are parallel in the real world seem to converge as they move away from you. So you can imagine looking down the road in front of you as you drive, looking down a set of railroad tracks, and how they seem to be getting closer to each other as they go. So in this lower image, if you look at the lines on the piazza here going at an angle and seeming to continue underneath that arch, and here as well. And those lines seem to converge toward one another as they go away from us, the viewer. Even in individual objects like this chalice up here, you can use linear perspective to make it seem very three-dimensional. The idea of linear perspective is based on that observation, and there's two other key points to it. The idea of a vanishing point is where all the diagonals meet. So in this diagram, this would be the vanishing point, and that vanishing point is usually always on the horizon line, and the horizon line is approximately equivalent to the height of a person, or to their eyes' height anyway. And so if you use this simple system, you can create, say, boxes or buildings or things flying in above our heads. All kinds of things can be created. It's actually a very fun experiment to stop and try to do some things with linear perspective. So you can pause here if you want to try that out. Another form of perspective would be called atmospheric perspective. And this is when objects that they want us to believe are in the distance appear more hazy and desaturated in color, whereas objects in the foreground, like these small figures gathered here, actually feel a little more vivid in color and a little more clarified. This is another good chance to pause and see if you can use these vocabulary terms as you describe Goya's The 3rd of May from 1808. So as you're taking notes, pause and see how you can kind of write out a little description of this piece using these the visual vocabulary. Now, color, of course, is a big part of what can catch our eyes as we look at an artwork. And just a few terms relating to color. The first would be hue, H-U-E, and that is the artistic word for what we usually mean by the names of colors. When we say, oh, we like your red shirt, we're really trying to describe the hue that we're seeing. Value, like we mentioned earlier, would be the lightness or darkness of a color. So that's value. Whereas saturation would be the brightness or intensity of a color. So value is the lightness and saturation would be the brightness. And those three terms are always interacting. Those three qualities of color are always interacting. The only few color terms, other color terms I'm going to introduce are just this. When you look at an artwork and the artist has tried to mimic or treat naturalistically the colors that they see, that would be called objective or observed colors. So both Thomas Anschutz here and Claude Monet, although Claude Monet's color is much more saturated, both of these artists are still actually trying to capture what they observed in nature, trying to be generally true to reality. This is different when we look at images like this by Bob Thompson and Andre Durain, who here are using an expressive or subjective color palette, trying to convey their emotions or use color symbolically in these images. Just a few principles to sum up our discussion here. Balance is always worth pointing out, how a composition is organized. And both this painting and this beautiful work of architecture from India both use symmetrical balance, which means that their right and left halves have a similar visual weight. Now, an image does not have to be what we call like a mirror image on each side, but just similar visual weight on each side. This tends to give a sense of organization. It's a little bit predictable, but feels very stable. We tend to like this in churches and in other religious buildings and in governmental buildings. It tends to feel very trustworthy. There's another type of balance called asymmetrical balance. Now this is still balanced, still harmonious and unified. However, the right and left halves have different visual weight. So on each of these paintings, it happens that the right side has a little bit heavier forms and closer forms. And then the left side of each has a little greater distance and kind of lightness to it, but still balanced, still harmonious and whole. Simplicity or economy versus complexity is also worth pointing out. So simplicity is not the same as simplistic, which is not a negative term, not a complimentary term, but simplicity or economy can just mean that they're using few elements to make their point. So on the left-hand side, we have Brancusi's Sleeping Muse, and here he's chosen to be very simple, or to create an image that's very austere. He's not put a lot of texture, a lot of detail in this image, because it's more of an idea. It's not a specific person that he's describing here, but the idea of an inspirational muse. Whereas on the right, the artist Koisovoy was trying to do a very specific portrait, and so he wanted to put in details of the armor and the hair and the face so that we could recognize the specific person and also have a sense of his heroism. So this image has a lot of complexity to it, a lot of detail and a lot of texture. Proportions are worth pointing out. How big is the sculpture, or how big is the piece of art that you're looking at? So proportions just mean the relative size of the artwork. Now, one way to look at proportions is to discuss how the relative size of the artwork relates to the viewer specifically. So when we look at Klaus Oldenburg's clothespin here, we're used to holding a clothespin in our hand and it being very small, and yet here he's made this clothespin 45 feet tall, and so the proportions here really throw us for a loop. They really surprise us, and they're definitely worth commenting on. Just with the scale of a piece, the proportions of a piece, an artist can really draw you in to a very small piece and make it a very intimate encounter. Or with a very large piece like this one, the proportions really kind of shout out at you and really call attention to themselves. So proportions matter quite a lot, and that's one thing that gets lost when we're looking at artworks in a book or on our video screen. It can be really difficult to realize the actual proportions of the piece. So it's really helpful to look at the size of the piece. Usually underneath the label in your book, it will tell you the size of the piece, and that's worth taking note of. Also, in terms of proportions, we can look at how a piece relates to its environment. And this is really important when we're looking at historical work. So we've probably all seen Michelangelo's David, a very large sculpture. But when we see where he intended it to be placed, we know why he made it as large as he did. So this is a diagram of the building, the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, Italy, and his David was designed to go right here. And you see how tall the tower was above the sculpture, and also how many other sculptures were around it. Right over here, there's a fountain, probably 15 other sculptures here in this loggia to the side. So he wanted it to be large, to be noticed in front of this building, and also to kind of compete with the other sculptures around it. So knowing the original environment of a work can be really significant. And so the final term I want to introduce here is in situ. Sometimes I'll say in course, or you might read in your book, something about the situ, the original situation or site of an artwork. And most artists consider that situ or that situation to be integral, to be an important part of the artwork, that they designed the size, the colors, the lighting of their artwork for that original place. And again, when we're looking at our book or looking at our lectures in class, it's easy to kind of lose place of the fact that that artwork had an original environment. But as much as possible, it's worth trying to remember that, or trying to find out what the original situ of an artwork was and how the artist planned for that location. Now, the last thing we're going to do in this short lecture is to actually get you to draw. Yes, you're going to do just a bit of drawing. No talent or previous experience is required, and yes, stick figures are just fine. Grab a pencil and eraser and some blank or unlined paper. And we are going to do just a simple diagram. Our objective here is not to come up with photorealistic drawings, but to try to experience the artwork itself. And this can be really helpful to do when you're going to a museum or a gallery. I often take a sketchbook with me and just sketch from what I see. Again, not to make a finished artwork, but just to help me see the artwork better. I like to think of it as sort of singing along with your favorite song. So I know that all of you guys in your cars or maybe in the shower, you sing with your favorite songs, or maybe you kind of drum along with them. And you do that even if you're tone deaf or have terrible rhythm. You just enjoy it. So try to enjoy diagramming these artworks without putting pressure on yourself. The first thing you're going to do is just begin with the external boundaries. So if you were looking at a square-shaped canvas or a circular-shaped canvas, you would draw that. We are going to be looking at a rectangular-shaped artwork. So we start with a simple rectangle. And then I'll also have you sketch in vertical and horizontal axes right through the middle. And this is just to help us in our mind's eye locate the different parts, the different shapes and lines that we see, and try to help ourselves think, oh, well, was the shape in the top left or right in the dead center or in the bottom right quadrant? Just helps us to break up the space a little bit more. The third thing you want to do is look at the artwork, which I'll show you in just a moment, and you're just going to observe the basic lines and shapes. Simplify it to its most basic lines and shapes. And then you'll begin placing those lines and shapes on the page in relation to the axis or the edges. Now keep in mind, it is not the product, not your finished product, but it's the process. It's what you learn as you draw that matters here. So this is the image we're going to sketch, and I'm going to have you bring it to class with you next time. And I'll show you what I'm looking for. So before you begin, let me show you the next image. Something along these lines. The image on the left is just fine. It's very simple. You've got a sense of the circle of his head, the circle of his medallion, or the half circle, I should say, of his medallion, the half circle of his mantle here, and the half circle of his throne here. A lot of great circles here. These kind of long axes of his scepters here, but very simplified. If you would like to, you could put in some value or shading here, but it's not necessary. So you can pause here and work on your drawing. And then when you're done, bring your lecture notes and this diagram with you to our next class. Thanks so much for joining me.